We are an evidence-based, human-focused consultancy. And what that means is that, yes, we're data-driven, but the focus of the data is always people. And what makes places is the fact that we're with other people and that we're able to move, interact, and transact. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the specific methodology that we use at Space Syntax, which is based on understanding the city as the fundamental infrastructure that we have to deal with that enables us to then look at its performance. And therefore, we work with what we call an integrated urban model that layers the spatial network with all of the other indicators that we can begin to think of. But again, our point of departure is the spatial network. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, and I'm happy to then maybe talk to you about how the model works. But it's a relatively simple, efficient model that takes street network connectivity, translates it into values. You could actually do this on a piece of paper if you wanted to. Obviously, when you talk about big systems, the computer network and the computer capability comes in. But it's about the ability to objectively understand and set a standard that we can share and say, do we agree that there are certain principles that have to do with the street network connectivity that are valuable and that they're objectively and being able to define itself. And again, one of the key elements is from that, the understanding of the spatial network, those values that I showed you earlier, have a correlation with movement, land use, property value, criminal activity as well, and eventually the carbon footprint. We can have layouts that are either walkable or drivable. We want to have both. We're not anti-car, but we are pro-pedestrians and cyclists. And so this is the main concept of the spatial network as the infrastructure. And obviously the problem is that it's slow, expensive, and difficult to change. As urban practitioners, which is our background at Space Syntax, we understand that making changes takes a long time, and we see projects on the ground that we've started working on 10, 20 years ago. But as long as we're interested in people, we have to understand the spatial network. So it's the idea of being able to bring those spatial network as infrastructure with a social network and linking them across, and potentially suggesting that this might be a standard for city data and modeling. And again, we are starting from the spatial network, public transport, land use, population, employment densities, things that are presumably out there, but we, and as I'm sure some of you have already spoken about, have to be standardized. And then they're about the social performance and the user focus outcomes. Here is a framework that we're beginning to look at, where we have at the bottom of the diagram the potential databases of people, urban form, resource and energy. We mostly deal with the left element. We then have an integrated urban model that will allow us to do a set of outputs, which could be called performance analytic, location profiling, and design feedback. So we have a model that allows us to, within this framework, bring in different data sets, again, fundamentally on the basis of spatial layouts, and then talk about the consequences of certain interventions, whether they're spatial or otherwise. And within our area, it's about testing the impact of design changes and predicting what those design changes might mean, because in the same instance that we know that infrastructure takes a long time to change, we leave with the legacy of infrastructure. So we might as well get it right from the beginning. What we're able to do is process data in a much larger scale than we ever had. So what we see on the screen is the spatial accessibility map of mainland UK. I'm not going to go into the detail, but what that allows us is to, again, compare that with population and be able to benchmark, if that was the question, whether there's potential for growth. So if we were going to grow, where would we grow? The whole idea is that this becomes a useful tool to share data, facilitate long-term longitudinal analysis and research to improve decision making. And that's currently what we're doing. What we'll show you now is sort of an application of some of those case studies. But again, it has to do with being able to profile the performance of plays by a number of indicators. And the interesting thing becomes about open data. Our platforms are open source. So you are able to download the software and use it and apply it. And we hope to be able to, in the next months, release some of the spatial analysis, again, as an open source data set. And this is where we're thinking at the moment of the different type of time relationships about data, the long-term census data, for example, the medium one that has to do with allowing us better reaction, and then data that comes at the everyday monitoring data. For us, for example, pedestrian movement data is fundamental. I'm now going to very quickly show you some of the work that we've done with the team that has to do with collecting data in a way that hopefully gives us a snapshot of the first baseline of how the city is working. We, again, are using some of the data that's collected by the city through their Springboard. You will be familiar, it's not a lot, but at least it's longitudinal, so we can analyze how the city, or actually the retail streets, perform through that. And I'm just showing you some examples very quickly of some of that data, potentially data sharing, some of the data mapping, so the not only the sensing, but also the mapping and the analysis of that data. That's only mapping census data for walking journeys in Glasgow. The same thing for cycling journeys and for public transport. And this is the scary one for private transport, which again begins to show maybe data that we already know, but we can begin looking at potential strategies for that. So one of the striking elements is that within the city centre, about half the trips are done with private cars as opposed to walking. Once you reach out, we begin seeing an increase of public transport use. So again, some of the data to benchmark where we want to get to. Another element of data set is a set of land uses, and we can then combine them and begin to describe the existing condition of the city centre of Glasgow. And you will be familiar with the Z-shape movement retail corridor that's emerging, and quite quickly a diagnostic that identifies the area of Brumilo, one of the districts, as lacking in some of that vibrancy. And I'll show you in a moment the result of the challenge, which is extending not only that vibrancy, because that would be quite sort of easy to do, simply to draw this over, but what we've done as a team is begin to understand what are the key elements that we need to look at in terms of the spatial structure and the land use element to be able to effect this change. I hope you can see that from the back, but this is the spatial analysis of the city centre and the urban character in terms of the mobility. And quite simply, the red areas are representing areas where there's high movement potential or high spatial accessibility, and the blue areas are the ones that have a less movement potential or they're more segregated. And again, very quickly and in detail, we've used this as the main driver for understanding and designing change and analysis and benchmarking. And to understand, for example, we have Glasgow, Manchester, and Edinburgh at more or less the same scale. And one of the key things that we're looking at is the accessibility at what we call global and local level. And that means the transport that happens at the citywide scale and the transport that happens at the local scale. And quite perhaps unsurprisingly, once you look at it, is that Glasgow is dominant by almost twice the size of the street network length with global links only. And that's obviously the M8. So what we're trying to think about is how to use this information to begin informing design and then bringing this into the benchmark and increasing the population and land use if that's the decision. So again, some of the existing design with potential options, and what I'm just going to flick back and forth to show some of the design changes that we're proposing in bringing in a more integrated network into the city centre, but also to densify the different districts. To get somewhere like this was taken, I mean, this is in the, where are we? Under the M8 and the Anderson Crossing, where one of the key things that we've understood over the last 25 years is that despite the best efforts of traffic engineering, a pedestrian desire line is stronger than that. But Glasgow does a lot of things really well. And the idea that you can have a shared approach to a street, and the street can be both used for moving, for sitting down and having a coffee, but also for movement of vehicles and cyclists as well. And again, it's something that as a team we're putting together in a number of small, medium and large scale projects. And Simon is now going to talk about some of those backgrounds.